Part 4 of The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath. There were the charred embers of many camps where the lava gatherers were wont to stop, and several rude altars which they had built either to perpetuate the great ones or to ward off what they dreamed of in Negranic's high passes and labyrinthine caves. At evening, Carter reached the farthermost pile of embers and camped for the night. Tethering his zebra to a sapling and wrapping himself well in his blankets before going to sleep, and all through the night, Avunith howled distantly from the shore of some hidden pool. But Carter felt no fear of that amphibious terror, since he had been told with certainty that not one of them dares even approach the slope of Negranic. In the clear sunshine of morning, Carter began the long ascent, taking his zebra as far as that useful beast could go, but tying it to a stunted ash tree when the floor of the thin wood became too steep. Thereafter he scrambled up alone, first through the forest with its ruins of old villages in overgrown clearings, and then over the tough grass where the anamic shrubs grew here and there. He regretted coming clear of the trees, since the slope was very precipitous and the whole thing rather dizzying. At length he had begun to discern all the countryside spread out beneath him whenever he looked about. The deserted huts of the image makers, the groves of resin trees, and the camps of those who gathered from them, the woods where prismatic magas nest and sing, and even a hint very far from the shores of Yath, and of those forbidding ancient ruins, whose name is forgotten. He found it best not to look around, and kept on climbing and climbing till the shrubs became very sparse, and there was often nothing but the tough grass to cling to. Then the soil became meager, with great patches of bare rock cropping out, and now and then the nest of a condor in a crevice. Finally, there was nothing at all but the bare rock, and had it not been very rough and weathered, he could scarcely have ascended farther. Knobs, ledges, and pinnacles, however, helped greatly, and it was cheering to see occasionally the sign of some lava gatherer scratched clumsily in the friable stone, and know that wholesome human creatures had been there before him. After a certain height, the presence of man was further shown by handholds and footholds hewn where they were needed, and by little quarries and excavations where some choice vein or stream of lava had been found. In one place, a narrow ledge had been chopped artificially to an especially rich deposit far to the right of the main line of ascent. Once or twice, Carter dared to look around, and was almost stunned by the spread of landscapes below. All the island betwixt him and the coast lay open to his sight, with the harnessed stone terraces and the smoke of its chimneys mystical in the distance, and beyond that the illimitable southern sea with all its curious secrets. Thus far there had been much winding around the mountain, so that the farther and carven side was still hidden. Carter now saw a ledge running upward and to the left, which seemed to head the way he wished, and this, of course, he took in the hope that it might prove continuous. After 10 minutes he saw that it was indeed no cul-de-sac, but that it led steeply on in an arc, which would, unless suddenly interrupted or deflected, bring him, after a few hours climbing, to to that unknown southern slope, overlooking the desolate crags and the accursed valley of lava. As new country came into view below him, he saw that it was bleaker and wilder than those seaward lands he had traversed. The mountain's side, too, was somewhat different, being here pierced by curious cracks and caves not found on the straighter route he had left. Some of these were above him and some beneath him, all opening on sheerly perpendicular cliffs and wholly unreachable by the feet of man. The air was very cold now, but so hard was the climbing that he did not mind it. Only the increasing rarity bothered him, and he thought that perhaps it was this which had turned the heads of other travelers and excited those absurd tales of night gaunts, whereby they explained the loss of such climbers as fell from these perilous paths. He was not much impressed by travelers' tales, but had a good, curved scimitar in case of any trouble. All lesser thoughts were lost in the wish to see that carven face which might set him on the track of the entities atop unknown Kadath. At last, in the fearsome iciness of upper space, he came round fully to the hidden side of the granite and saw in infinite gulfs below him the lesser crags and sterile abysses of lava, which marked the old wrath of the great ones. There was unfolded, too, a vast expanse of country to the south, but it was a desert land without fair fields or cottage chimneys, and seemed to have no ending. No trace of the sea was visible on this side, for Oriab is a great island. Black caverns and odd crevices were still numerous on the sheer vertical cliffs, but none of them was accessible to a climber. There now loomed aloft a great beetling mast which hampered the upward view, and Carter was for a moment shaken with doubt lest it prove impassable, poised in windy insecurity miles above earth, with only space and death on one side and only slippery walls of rock on the other. He knew for a moment the fear that makes men shun the granite's hidden side. He could not turn around, yet the sun was already low. If there was no way aloft, the night would find him crouching there still, and the dawn would not find him at all. But there was a way, and he saw it in due season. Only a very expert dreamer could have used those imperceptible footholds, yet to Carter they were sufficient. Surmounting now the outward hanging rock, he found the slope much easier than that below, since a great glacier's melting had left a generous space with loam and ledges. To the left, a precipice dropped straight from unknown heights to unknown depths, with the cave's dark mouth just out of reach above him. Elsewhere, however, the mountain slanted back strongly, and even gave him space to lean and rest. He felt from the chill that he must be near the snow line, and he looked up to see what glittering pinnacles might be shining in that late ruddy sunlight. Surely enough, there was snow uncounted thousands of feet above, and below it a great beetling crag, like that he had just climbed, hanging there forever in bold outline. And when he saw that crag, he gasped and cried aloud and clutched at the jagged rock in awe, for the Titan bulge had not stayed as Earth's dawn had shaped it, but gleamed red and stupendous in the sunset with the carved and polished features of what people might consider to be a god. Stern and terrible shone that face that the sunset lit with fire. How vast it was, no mind can ever measure. But Carter knew at once that man could never have fashioned it. It was an entity chiseled by the hands of the entities, and it looked down haughtily and majestic upon the seeker. Rumor had said it was strange and not to be mistaken, and Carter saw that it was indeed so, with those long narrow eyes and long lobed ears, and that thin nose, and pointed chin all spoke of a race that is not of men, but of the entities. Now, as a side note, I know about ancient alien theorists and all that stuff. Humanity does amazing things. Yeah, there are spiritual entities that people encounter, but humanity does amazing things. We don't need aliens coming from elsewhere to build the pyramids. It turns out humans could have physically done a lot of this stuff. Some we don't quite know how, but some technologies just get lost just because modern man doesn't remember a particular technology, or carving crystals or whatever doesn't mean. Stern and terrible, shown that he clung overawed in that lofty and perilous eyrie, even though it was this which he had expected and come to find. For there is in an entity's face more of marvel than prediction can tell. And when that face is vaster than a great temple, and seen looking downward at sunset in the skytic silences of that upper world, from whose dark lava it was divinely hewn of old, the marvel is so strong that none may escape it. Here, too, was the added marvel of recognition, for although he had planned to search all dreamland over for those whose likeness to this face might mark them as the entity's children, he now knew that he need not do so. Certainly, the great face carven on that mountain was of no strange sort, but the kin of such as he had seen often in the taverns of the seaport of Kadath, which lies in Uth Argaeth, beyond the Tanarian hills, and is ruled over by that king Karanis, whom Carter once knew in waking life. Every year sailors with such a face came in dark ships from the north to trade their onks for a carved jade and spun gold, and little red singing birds of Kadath. And it was clear that these could be no others than the half-entities that he sought. Humans that had become Nexions for the fire beings, maybe? Where they dwelt, there must the cold waste lie close, and within it unknown Kadath, and its Ank's castle were the great ones. So to Kadath he must go, far distant from the Isle of Oriath, and in such parts as would take him back to Dilath Lean, and up the sky to the bridge by Nir, and again to the enchanted wood of the Zoogs, whence the way would bend northward through the garden lands by Urkranos, the gilded spires of Thran, where he might find a galleon bound over the Carenarian Sea. But dusk was now thick, and the great carven face looked down, even sterner in shadow. Perched on that ledge, night found the seeker, and the blackness he might neither go down nor up, but only stand and cling and shiver in that narrow space till the day came, praying to keep awake, lest sleep lose his hold and send him down the dizzying miles of air to the crags and sharp rocks of the cursed valley. The stars came out, but save for them, there was only black nothingness in his eyes, nothingness leagued with death, against whose beckoning he might do no more than cling to the rocks and lean back away from an unseen brink. The last thing of earth that he saw in the gloaming was a condor soaring close to the westward precipice beside him, and darting, screaming away when it came near the cave, whose mouth yawned just out of reach. Suddenly, without a warning, sound in the dark, Carter felt his carved scimitar drawn stealthily out of his belt by some unseen hand, and then he heard it clatter down over the rocks below, and between him and the Milky Way, he thought he saw a very terrible outline of something noxiously thin, and horned, and tailed, and bat-winged. Other things, too, had begun to blot out patches of stars west of him, as if a flock of vague entities were flapping thickly and silently out of that inaccessible cave in the face of the precipice. Then a sort of cold, rubbery arm seized his neck, and something else seized his feet, and he was lifted inconsiderately up and swung about in space. Another minute, and the stars were gone, and Carter knew that the night gaunts had got him. They bore him breathless into that cliffside cavern, and through monstrous labyrinths beyond. When he struggled, as at first he did by instinct, they tickled him with deliberation. They made no sound at all themselves, and even their membranous wings were silent. They were frightfully cold and damp and slippery, and their paws needed one detestably. Soon they were plunging hideously downward, through inconceivable abysses, in a whirling, giddying, sickening rush of dank, tomb-like air. And Carter felt they were shooting into the ultimate vortex of shrieking and demonic madness. He screamed again and again, but whenever he did so, the black paws tickled him with greater subtlety. Then he saw a sort of gray phosphorescence about, and guessed they were coming even to that inner world of subterranean horror of which dim legends tell, and which is litten only by the pale death fire wherewith reeks the ghoulish air and the primal mists of the pits at earth's core. At last, far below him, he saw faint lines of gray and ominous pinnacles, which he knew must be fabled peaks of Throck. Awful and sinister they stand in the haunted disk of sunless and eternal depths, higher than man may reckon, and guarding terrible valleys where the dullest crawl and burrow nastily. But Carter preferred to look at them than at his captors, which were indeed shocking and uncouth black things with smooth, oily, whale-like surfaces, unpleasant horns that curved inward toward each other, bat wings whose beatings made no sound, ugly prehensile paws, and barbed tails that lashed needlessly and disquietingly. And worst of all, they never spoke or laughed, and never smiled, because they had no faces at all to smile with, but only suggestive blankness, where a face ought to be. All they ever did was clutch and fly and tickle, and that was the way of night gaunts. As the band flew lower, the peaks of Throck rose gray and towering on all sides, and one saw clearly that nothing lived on that austere and impressive granite of the endless twilight. At still lower levels, the death fires in the air gave out, and one met only the primal blackness of the void save aloft, where the thin peaks stood out goblin-like. Soon the peaks were very far away, and nothing about but great rushing winds and the dankness of nethermost grottos in them. Then in the end the night gaunts landed on a floor of unseen things which felt like layers of bones, and left Carter all alone in that black valley. To bring him thither was the duty of the night gaunts that guard Nagranich, and this done they flapped away silently. When Carter tried to trace their flight, he found he could not, since even the peaks of Throck had failed out of sight. There was nothing anywhere but blackness and horror and silence and bones. Now Carter knew from a certain source that he was the Vale of Kadath, where crawl and burrow the enormous Dolus, but he did not know what to expect, because no one has ever seen Dalhu, or even guessed what such a thing may be like. Dolls are known only by dim rumor from the rustling they make amongst mountains of bones and slimy touch they have when they wriggle past one. They cannot be seen because they creep only in the dark. Carter did not wish to meet a doll, but listened intently for any sound in the unknown depths of bones about him. Even in this fearsome place, he had a plan and objective. For whispers of Kadath were not unknown to one with whom he had talked much in the old days. In brief, it seemed fairly likely that this was the spot into which all the ghouls of the waking world cast the refuse of their feastings, and that, if he had good luck, he might stumble upon that mighty crag, taller than even Throck's peaks, which marks the edge of their domain. Showers of bones would tell him where to look, and, once found, he could call to a ghoul to let down a ladder. For strange to say, he had a very singular link with these terrible creatures. A man he had known in Boston, a painter of strange pictures, with a secret studio in an ancient and unhallowed alley near a graveyard, had actually made friends with the ghouls and had taught him to understand the simpler part of their disgusting meeping and glibbering. Isn't Meeps like a character on Sesame Street? I don't know, it's been a long time. This man had vanished at last, and Carter was not sure, but he might find him now, and use, for the first time in dreamland, that faraway English of his dim waking life. In any case, he felt he could persuade a ghoul to guide him out of Kadath, and it would be better to meet a ghoul which one can see than a ghoul which one cannot see. So Carter walked in the dark and ran when he thought he heard something among the bones underfoot. Once he bumped into a stony slope and knew it must be the base of one of Throck's peaks. Then at last he heard a monstrous rattling and clatter which reached far up in the air, and became sure that he had come nigh to the crag of the ghouls. He was not sure he could be heard from this valley, miles below, but realized that the inner world has strange laws. As he pondered, he was struck by a flying bone so heavy that it must have been a skull, and therefore realizing his nearness to the fateful crag, he sent up, as best as he might, that meeping cry which is the call of the ghoul. Yip, 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 bah, bah. No, I don't know what the cry is supposed to be. Sounds travel slowly. So, it was some time before he heard an answering glimmer. But it came at last, and before long he was told that a rope ladder would be lowered. The wait for this was very tense, since there was no telling what might not have been stirred up among those bones by his shouting. Indeed, it was not long before he actually did hear a vague rustling afar off. As this thoughtfully approached, he became more and more uncomfortable, for he did not wish to move away from the spot where the ladder would come. Finally, the tension grew almost unbearable, and he was about to flee in panic, when the thud of something on the newly heaped bones nearby drew his notice from the other sound. It was the ladder, and after a minute of groping, he had it taut in his hands. But the other sound did not cease, and followed him even as he climbed. He had gone fully 5 feet from the ground, when the rattling beneath waxed emphatic, and was a good 10 feet up when something swayed the ladder from below. At a height which must have been 15 or 20 feet, he felt his whole side brushed by a great slippery length which grew alternately convex and concave with wriggling. And he climbed desperately to escape the unendurable nuzzling of that loathsome and overfed dole, whose form no man might see. For hours he climbed, with aching and blistered hands, seeing again the gray death fire and Throck's uncomfortable pinnacles. At last he discerned above him the projecting edge of the great crag of the ghouls, whose vertical side he could not glimpse, and hours later he saw a curious face peering over it, as a gargoyle peers over a parapet of Notre Dame. This almost made him lose his hold through faintness, but a moment later he was himself again, for his vanished friend, Richard Pickman, had once introduced him to a ghoul, and he knew well their canine faces and slumping forms and unmentionable idiosyncrasies. So he had himself well under control when the hideous thing pulled him out from the dizzy emptiness over the edge of the crag, and did not scream at the partly consumed refuse. Heaped at one side are the squatting circles of ghouls who nod and watch curiously. Now in Arabic, the word ghoul refers to a spirit that can harm people. Usually, sneak attack or something. Islam does not believe that such things can exist, but that people can somatically hurt themselves. That belief in certain entities to do such things can have effects. He was now on a dim, litten plain, whose sole topographical features were great boulders and the entrances of burrows. The ghouls were in general respectful, even if one did attempt to pinch him, while several others eyed his leanness spectacularly. Through patient glibbering, he made inquiries regarding his vanished friend, and found he had become a ghoul of some prominence in the abysses near the waking world. A greenish, elderly ghoul offered to conduct him to Pickman's present habitation. So, despite a natural loathing, he followed the creature into a capacious burrow and crawled after him for hours in the blackness of rank mold. They emerged on a dim plain strewn with singular relics of earth, old gravestones, broken urns, and grotesque fragments of monuments. And Carter realized with some emotion that he was probably nearer the waking world than at any other time since he had gone down the 700 steps from the cavern of flame to the gate of the deeper slumber. There, on a tombstone of 1768, stolen from the granary burying ground in Boston, sat a ghoul, which was once the artist Richard Upton Pickman. It was naked and rubbery, and had acquired so much of the ghoulish physiognomy that its human origin was already obscure, but it still remembered a little English, and was able to converse with Carter in grunts and monosyllables, helped out now and then by the glimmering of ghouls. When it learned that Carter wished to get to the enchanted wood, and from there to the city Kadath to Uth Nargai, beyond the Tanarian hills, it seemed rather doubtful. For these ghouls of the waking world do no business in the graveyards of Upper Greenland, leaving that to the red-footed wants that are spawned in dead cities, and many things intervene betwixt their gulf and the enchanted wood, including the terrible kingdom of the Gugs. The Gugs, hairy and gigantic, once reared stone circles in that wood, and made strange sacrifices to other entities, and the crawling chaos, Nyarlathotep, until one night an abomination of theirs reached the ears of the earth's entities, and they were banished to caverns below. Only a great trapdoor of stone with an iron ring connects the abyss of the earth ghouls with enchanted wood, and this the Gugs are afraid to open because of a curse. That a mortal dreamer could traverse their cavern realm and leave by that door is inconceivable, for mortal dreamers were their former food, and they have legends of toothsome of such dreamers, even though banishment has restricted their diet to the gas, those repulsive beings which die in the light, and which live in the vaults of Zin and leap on long hind legs like kangaroos. So the ghoul that was Pickman advised Carter either to leave the abyss at Sarkomand, that deserted city in the valley below, laying where black nitrous stairways, guarded by winged Diarot lions, lead down from Dreamland to the lower gulf, or to return through a churchyard to the waking world and begin the quest anew down the 70 steps of light slumber to the cavern of flame, and the 700 steps to the gate of deeper slumber and the enchanted wood. This, however, did not suit the seeker, for he knew nothing of the way from Lang to Uth-Nargai, and was likewise reluctant to awake, lest he forget all he had so far gained in this dream. It was disastrous to his quest to forget the august and celestial faces of those seamen from the north who traded Ankhs and Caliphais, and who, being the sons of entities, must point the way to the cold waste in Kadath, where the great ones dwelt. After much persuasion, the ghoul consented to guide his guests inside the great wall of the Gug's kingdom. There was one chance that Carter might be able to steal through the twilight realm of circular stone towers at an hour where the giants would be all gorged and snoring indoors, and reach the central tower with the sign of Koth upon it. Is it this thing? Or this thing? Or is it that thing? Which has the stairs leading up to that stone trapdoor in the enchanted wood. Now, the Elder sign and some other stuff in the Necronomicon is not the same as some of what Lovecraft said. But Pickman ever consented to lead 3 ghouls to help with the tombstone lever in raising the stone door, for ghouls of the Gugs are somewhat afraid, and they often flee from their own colossal graveyards when they see them feasting there. He also advised Carter to disguise himself, shaving the beard he had allowed to grow, for ghouls have none, wallowing naked in the mold to get the correct surface, and loping in the usual slumping way, with his clothing carried in a bundle as if it were a choice morsel from a tomb. That would reach the city of the Googs, which is conterminous with the whole kingdom, through the proper burrows emerging in a cemetery not far from the stair-containing Tower of Koth. They must beware, however, of a larger cave near the cemetery. For this,